This is history too. And this is a photograph of a replica of the Parthenon that's in Nashville, Tennessee. And this is Athena, a reproduction of the 40-foot statue that was in the Parthenon and was there for quite a long time. It was there for 850 years, and in 400 AD, it was removed from Athens and taken to Constantinople because the new Roman Empire in the East was centered in Constantinople rather than in Rome. The fate of the statue of Athena was unknown in later Byzantine times. But the replica is a replica of one of the most extraordinary focuses of insight into civilization. The Parthenon itself is an expression of a very peculiar confluence of completely different currents. On one hand, in terms of art and architecture, in terms of the conscious visioning and the expression of it into form, personal artistic forms, that then generate a historical dynamic out of it, is one of the great triumphs of world civilization. At the very same time, there's an undertow. Because when one understands the ritual underpinning of the forcing of a certain style of cultural experience, all dominated by symbolic forms that are well planned out and are meant to control. The Parthenon is one of the red flags for our kind. Both of these qualities are true. Both are there. They are not discernible unless one is able to go into the history. And it's only by going into the history that one can understand what one of our authors that we're taking, Thucydides, the other being Tacitus, that Thucydides states at the beginning of his history of the Peloponnesian War, that knowing now what he knows about human nature and about civilizations, the war that tore apart Greek civilization will happen again and again and again until the cycle is broken, and must be broken by a transformation that man must change. 500 years later, Tacitus delivers in his Annals of Imperial Rome the confirmation that Thucydides was right, because the entire scenario replayed itself in his time to the deadly dismay of everyone. And instead of just involving the Aegean Sea and the Greek islands and Greek mainland with some repercussions into Ionia, the Ionian coast that is now part of Turkey, the repetition of what happened in the Aegean Sea now happened in the entire Roman world. And one of the scary things about Tacitus, knowing what he knew about Thucydides, and the layers of history that led up to him, Tacitus is full of the psychological term would be a mysterium tremendans. There is a haunting, panicking, hurricane warning in Tacitus that the next time that this happens, the world may not be able to recover from this. And so we're taking Thucydides and Tacitus because they make the classic development that history really is. And in the 2,400 years since Thucydides and the 2,000 years since Tacitus, again and again we have seen replays of what happened to Greece, replays of what happened to Rome, but one of the most insidious things, like a lingering virus, we face in our own time a situation which is catastrophic. Because it's not only that the entire world would be involved in a war or in a tyranny, but that life itself on the planet is jeopardized. When there is a control of nuclear weapons, of molecular and atomic and cellular manipulations of not just DNA, but all through the genome, all through the proteome, one can design hormones and redesign the genetic structure. So it is something which is important for us to understand what to do, to not do what is inevitably ingrained in civilization. And what is ingrained, as we talked about last week, are two diseases, war and empire. And they haunt civilization as if they were like old viruses that only go dormant, they do not die out. And the prescription of both Thucydides and Tacitus is that man must change and that he can change. And this is the wonderful thing about history, is that it is a very high conscious process. It carries the ability to take the dynamic of nature, which forms the substrate for the dynamic of experience, to bring nature and experience, nature and the mythic experience of images, feelings, language, to bring those two flows through a third process called vision, visionary differential consciousness, to bring experience in nature through visionary consciousness and put it into play in a very high level of visionary consciousness called history, historical consciousness. And that all four of those processes together make a very wide kind of diamond of how the universe works, of how all of what we are and could become operates and works. And it's important to understand that history is a very high energy process. Without our phase formed learning, it is impossible to remember the complexity enough to be able to learn how to deal with history. And it's not just history of civilization, but the historical process, which leads to war and empire in civilizations, leads to a murderous ego in individuals and to a tyrannical lifestyle to ensure that that the tyrannical ego is protected enough, insured enough, that it will not resort to either suicide or murder. There's a very, very different scale of situations then. So that as individuals, we face the same problem that regressive civilizations face. And the cure is the same: transform. Because if the individual identity in the mind is not transformed into a conscious person who is capable of a whole range of possibilities, the closed mind will pull back all those possibilities and mulch them together into a doctrine, an ideological indoctrination, and it will force everyone eventually to do what they say. And this kind of an inflated ego is called a dictator. And in Rome, he was called a dictator. But in Greece, he was called a tyrant. And part of the difficulty is that when we look at the glory of Athena in her Parthenon, in this replica of the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee, full scale, we can see in this one pivot one of the most extraordinary things about the historical process is that if it doesn't obtain, then the effective play of the person in consciousness has to stay in the field out of which it emerged, the field of vision, the field of consciousness. But it cannot just stay there because it has emerged from there and cannot go back and just remain there. Once you are born, you cannot go back into the womb. Once a form comes out of its emergent process, that form then has reality and must have its play on the scale and in the dimensions in which it is real. Otherwise, it slips back automatically into the unreal. And the unreal has a regressive quality which does not just stop, but keeps regressing. And when a regression starts on to its negative de-evolution, it gains a quality which is like a corkscrew that goes in smaller and smaller and smaller increments until it becomes just a point, and that point is abstracted from any kind of a real context and ends up by being an isolated speck of alien quality to its own life and to the actual universe, and becomes literally a radioactive speck, and all it takes is one speck of plutonium. And you will die from cancer within a very short period of time. Because plutonium is the perfect example of a transformed element that is not in nature. Nature can accommodate even radioactive elements like radium or thorium or uranium, or gases like radon, which eventually would poison life if they were not dispelled in a very large ecology of the planet's circulation. But plutonium is a supernatural element. It was never made in nature. It was made because of a conscious transformation. And all the trans-uranium elements are like that. Plutonium is the perfect example. It is deadly to the entire cycle of nature. Once someone has emerged powerfully from the transformed mind, if they go back to that mind with that supercharge, it's like introducing radioactivity into the structure. The radioactivity in this case, though, is an inflation, a distortion, a magnification. So our learning is a way that wisdom throughout the millennia, or I should say throughout the scores of millennia, that men and women like ourselves learned a long time ago how to deal with the supernatural so it does not become radioactive and haunt us and stalk us and kill us. The very first civilizations on this planet go back to the Paleolithic. And at the beginning of Paleolithic civilization, about 35,000 years ago, one of the things that was posited was that there needs to be a cycle of initiation into stages of learning that carry you through the natural end in death and carry you beyond that into the rebirth of life again. That death is not an ending, but is a transform as a part of an ecology of nature and leads to a larger horizon, that there is both a world underneath death and there is a world over death, a netherworld and an overworld. And so the wisdom traditions, even in the middle of that span from 36,000 years ago, where Paleolithic art was in the caves, about midway is Lascaux in France. And it is at Lascaux about 18,000 years ago that you find the cycle of phase learning presented in Paleolithic terms for the first time very, very clearly. But there was no ability at the time to go beyond a invoking of a conscious vision put into an art form. There was no history. And Lascaux and all of the other Paleolithic civilizations were only good for a very short period of time and did not influence or develop because they had no historical quality. It didn't generate any history. It was not passed on. And so you had an atrophying. That atrophying became ingrained. And in classical Greece, about 490 BC, it came to a crunch because the Greek language world faced an invasion by an impossibly powerful force, the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire by that time had been generated over many thousands of years, had matured itself, beginning in Iranian history with Zarathustra about 1800 BC. So that by the time you get to 400 BC, the Iranian experience with very high level vision and enormously potent spiritual personality that exuded itself into a historical process, but one which was continually co-opted. When you read translations of Zarathustra's early Gathas, he is always talking about the wicked Kavis who are always usurping for their own clique the powers that are generated by people's visions and by people's activities, and they absorb it for themselves and they hold it in a tyrannical way over others. This particular tone is there very powerfully, as we talked about last week, because all of the early civilizations that developed a sense of being able to project themselves out with historical energy, with historical power, Iran was the center one. It's the only one that had contact both with the Egyptian Nile River civilization and with the Euphrates-Tigris civilization in Mesopotamia, and with the Indus civilization in India, and with the Central Asian civilization that went not on a river of water, but on a river of a caravan route that went all the way from Samarkand into Western China. And that 7,000 or 8,000 mile caravan route 4,000 years ago, later it would be called the Silk Road, but one could call the earlier one the Jade Road, because it introduced dynastic power into China for the first time, and the first Chinese dynasty, the Xia, is about 2250 BC. Before that, China had kings, but they never had a dynasty, and a dynasty is an empire. And for the first time, you see in Chinese imagery, which you did not see before, you see chariots. You see horses, and horses put into tandems, and chariots, which are like not just to get around, but in order to have a projection of military power that is stronger than any kind of a warrior, even stronger than groups of warriors. Because when you have a chariot and you have an archer in the chariot and a good driver, one can pick people off with fantastic speed and power. And so the introduction of the chariot, which you see at the very same time when it was introduced into Egypt, you get the same projection of power in Egypt that you got in China. And instead of there being a contentment just to hold all of Egypt, it wanted to spread itself out and take over as much as it could. So that the historical quality is that by the time of Thucydides, the Persian power was so formidable that when they came into Greece to take over in 490 BC, the Greeks realized that they could not fight against the Persian Empire power, but that they could hit it at a vulnerable spot because it was so huge, because the naval ships bringing 100,000 fighting men could not, at the beach at Marathon, disembark more than just several hundred people at a time. They met at the water's edge and foiled the Persians from being able to land. But under Xerxes, they came back 10 years later, and instead of going to Marathon, they decided that they would land exactly where Athens was and destroy it, which they did. And the Athenians had to flee. The leader of Athens at the time, Themistocles, had a mass exodus of the women and children and the elderly, and he pooled all of the men together to go into all of the ships that they could muster. And they defeated the ships of Xerxes off one of the islands, Salamis, off the port. Piraeus is the port for Athens, and Salamis is one of the big islands there in that Saronic Gulf. And so the naval force of the Persians was crippled, that they could not get their supplies for such huge land armies. And eventually, though the Persians were able to take over Athens, they burnt everything that they could. They destroyed everything that they possibly could, so that Athens would understand that it wasn't their courage at Marathon that was superior to their power and their ability to come back, but that the Athenians would be broken. What happened is that when the Persians could not supply their huge army, they had to withdraw them by land and by other means. And what it left in the wake was a catastrophic scar on the soul of the Greeks. And for 30 years, all of the burnt buildings on the Acropolis were left untouched to remind them of what had happened. And in response to that, the Athenians began to plan a confederacy of all the Greek little cities together, all the little city-state territories, and stitch them all together into a confederation. Because the Persians had come twice, if they came a third time, it's only by a confederation that they would be able to withstand the next brunt. In order to do this, Athens became the leader of this confederation, and over the 30 years, increasingly inflated its idea of itself. Themistocles, when he began, after the Persians left, he built 2 long walls all the way down to the port of Piraeus, so that they could be defended against a fairly large army, and then another long wall that went down to a little fishing area off to the side of the Piraeus. They planned then to be able to at least have a fortress that they could come back to. But then Themistocles was accused by Athenians of being conservative, like the Spartans in the southern part of Greece, in the Peloponnesian. And so he was exiled. And the man that came in, his name was Cimon, and he was one of the wealthiest men in Athens. And he decided that what they needed was not to cower behind fortifications, but to glory in the power that they had. And that one of the ways to glory in this power was to make the aristocratic people who ran Athens, and through Athens ran the Athenian Confederation, to make them very wealthy and very powerful, to get back all the wealth they had lost from the incursion of the Persians. And so the Athenian noble echelon, notice how in history, when the regression sets in, it doesn't just regress, but it increases by its inflation and its severity. They decided that the gold that the whole confederation kept on a sacred island of Delos, it was sacred to Apollo, was exposed and should be removed to a more protected place, which would be not only Athens, but it would be on the Acropolis of Athens, where it's easily defended. And so they moved about 22 tons of gold from Delos to Athens and put it on the Acropolis, and then used that money to finance a complete splendiferous transformation of Athens, of public buildings, of fantastic parks, of power so that the world would know that the Athenian wealthy class were really powerful and you should not mess with them because they could do whatever they wanted. Eventually, all the rest of the population of Athens and of Greece began to resent this, the reaction to this empire, the threat constantly of war. And so Cimon was turned out, and a new man came in to claim power for himself. His name was Pericles. And Pericles said, we need to have not the rule of the aristocracy, but we need the rule of the people, of a democracy, which would have its own council. And it's not necessary that one be noble born or one just be rich. It is only necessary that through the accumulated power of the population, we have a few powerful people on a council that then run things. And so one of the first really strong political parties was made in Athens. And political forms are always held together not by nobility and not just by wealth, but they're held together by inflated power held in a mental form called a political party. So that the state now is the larger projection out into the ritual landscape where everybody does this in their living, but it is planned out by the ideological doctrine of the Council of the Powerful, which of course means that wealth plays a great deal of this power, but is deceptive to think that it is wealth that holds this together. The pivot is inflated power. And the only way that that inflation power can happen is through a regression of the spiritual person back to an ideological identity of individuality in the mind. It's the only way it can happen. It doesn't happen in nature. It is not a part of the natural progression. The mind is not, when it is natural, does not inflate at all. It integrates. The quality of the mind in nature is that it integrates. It's a part of the integral cycle. The quality of ritual in nature is that it supports the objectivity of existence. We do such and so this way because that allows for this to happen, and when all of these happen, we live. And if we work together, our lives improve. The quality of our tradition is to support that our experience is really good when we live this way together, and that the mind naturally integrates that. It does not in any natural way inflate, nor does it have a regression into it. The regressive identity is a sign of radioactive poisoning, of the closed mind pulling back into itself a other than natural power. When it is in transformation, consciousness is differential. That's its nature. And the person that comes out of that is like a scintillating jewel, like a lens of possibilities. And that lens of possibilities, traditionally it's called either a diamond because of all of its different facets, or it's called a rainbow because it has all the colors that there are. It has the ability to generate historical consciousness, not as a part of its nature, but as a part of its further differentiating. And it's out of that further differentiating that we'll see that something very resonant with art occurs in that science. But when it's pulled back, art no longer is a differential form, but it becomes a propaganda tool. It becomes an ideological emblem of the inflated power, and also because history cannot occur, science is pulled back and is not science, but is a ritual confirmation of what you were looking for in terms of the ideological bias in the first place. And so we lose both science and art. History does not occur, and visionary consciousness evaporates, and all of that swells like a hurricane, which commandeers for itself all the energy that there is. The current big Hurricane Dennis that is off the Florida coast today has as much energy as about 1,000 atomic bombs. So that when you get this kind of swirl, the hurricane demon of inflation, the identity, capability of the closed mind becomes swelled into an ideology that is never satisfied except to grow, to be more. One of the most beautiful phrases is in a film classic called Key Largo, directed by John Huston, starring Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, and Edward G. Robinson as the gangster. And he commandeers this Key West resort to do a drug and counterfeit deal. And they're all captives in this hurricane that comes in. And the gangster, played by Robinson, gets scared, and Humphrey Bogart says, "Well, I know what you want." He says, "Yeah? What do you know about me?" He says, "You want more." And Edward G. Robinson takes his cigar out and he says, "Yeah, I want more. You hear that, Toots?" Toots is played by a man who owns a couple of restaurants here in the Gardens in Westwood and Kate Mantalini in Beverly Hills. So it's a quality where the inflated ego becomes tyrannical. And this goes back to Thucydides, because in the Greek language, a king is a part of the natural ecology. A king is like a symbolic integral for the kingdom, watches out for the kingdom and everyone who lives in there. But a tyrant is not watching out for the kingdom, is watching out to protect and ensure and enlarge their power. And the only way that a really super inflated ego can be sure that it is protected is to have eventually an empire where everyone is living to protect them. In the Han dynasty, already 140 BC, the Han Emperor Han Wuti had 130,000 people whose only job was to keep him alive, healthy, and growing in power. That was 2,100 years ago. The quality that's in Thucydides is that when you have someone like a Pericles, you have an optical illusion that is very difficult to see, because it seems like they are such a splendiferous quality that they must be fantastic persons. They must, because they're building art like the Parthenon. Pericles said, "We don't want to just have beautiful buildings, we want to build the most perfect building in the world on our Acropolis, so that everyone knows that we are the best that has ever lived or will ever live." And the Parthenon was that structure. We're going to take a little break and we'll come back. But one of the currents, as you can see in history, is that it is such a high-level process that when it is differential, it works in a very beautiful way. is very high magic. But it must be a resonant differentiation of the differential conscious process prismed through the spiritual person. Otherwise, history becomes a deadly, poisonous quality that only inflates the identity into falseness. Let's take a little break. Let's come back to this. This is a guide. This is the Greek guide to the Acropolis. There are no guides to Sparta. There are whole libraries of books about the Athenians. And in my very large library, I have one book on Sparta. There was a later historian in Roman times. His name was Pausanias. He was a world traveler. And for the entry on Sparta, he says you could hardly believe that they were as powerful as they were because it's just a village. There are no monuments. There are no grand buildings. Whereas when you go to Athens, it is so splendid and overwhelming. The buildings, the reputation, the grandeur, that you're sure that they were maybe 100 times the power of Sparta. But Athens lost the Peloponnesian War to the Spartans. The only way that we understand it so well is because of Thucydides. He was a general in the war on the side of the Athenians. His family had descended from the nobility of northern Greece, perhaps even over to the east in Thrace. So when during the Peloponnesian War, someone had to go to that region to fight against one of the most courageous of all the Spartan generals, Tacitus, they chose Thucydides, and he lost a very crucial battle to the Spartans. Tacitus was just militarily a genius. And so they relieved Thucydides and banished him, exiled him, because the Athenian power was this kind of thing. If you're not helping us to be more powerful and helping us to get more, then you're out. You're not just marginalized, you're excluded. So the Athenian power structure became an empire that is ideologically more and more exclusive and inclusive, and there are sharper and sharper bounds. And we have not only principles and laws and codes, but we mean to make them tighter and tighter and tighter, because if you're not with us, then you're out. And if you try to give us competition, you're dead. So exile and death. What comes out of that exile is not just an exile from the empire, but there is an exile quality in the mind for any aspect of oneself that doesn't cooperate with the ego. That quality must be exiled. And if it fights, it must be killed. One of the most poignant thinkers in the 20th century, he was a Frenchman. During the Nazi occupation of France, he ran the underground resistance newspaper called Combat. His co-editor was Jean-Paul Sartre, but the editor's name was Albert Camus. And he wrote a couple of the world's greatest novels and a couple of the world's greatest philosophic works. One of them was on the issue of the absurd, and the other was on the issue that is the projection of absurdity, because absurdity finally ends up in the issue of suicide. Because if life is absurd, if circumstances are absurd, if you're absurd, then what's the point of continuing to live? And so absurdity on the individual level ends up in an isolated absurdity that is always some form of suicide. But the inflated projection of it is not suicide, but someone else must die. It's murder. And so Camus' little book on the absurd was followed by a book on the social implications of murder, which become mass murder very, very easily, and finally become either a suicide for the planet or a murder of the planet. A suicide of living wrong so that nature cannot function. The oceans are polluted, the land is polluted, the food supply is polluted, the genome is polluted, and there's nothing left, a kind of a suicide or a kind of a murder. Anyone who doesn't agree with this, they must die. These are issues that have haunted civilization since they began. And in Lascaux, 18,000 years ago, the way that it was treated was a double transformation. Because you have to have both transformations in order to develop a sense of spiritual radiance. The first transformation is learning that you are not limited by your body, that your spirit will live beyond the season of this body. But the second transformation is that you are also a spirit that will live beyond this mind. The first transformation is taking the natural water and fermenting it and making a wine. The second transformation is taking the wine and learning how to distill it and making the cognac. Medicinal spirits are always distillations of something that has been fermented before. This is a very deep wisdom. And at Lascaux, the fermentation was a process where you came out of the landscape where you lived into the cave. And as you came into the cave had a series of paintings, Paleolithic paintings, on its walls in a sequence. And when you came into Lascaux, the very first thing you saw was the head of a black stallion, wild stallion horse, which was like the Paleolithic signature of the artist who painted Lascaux, most of it, or oversaw the painting of Lascaux. So we can call the artist who made Lascaux 18,000 years ago Black Stallion. And that black stallion head is the beginning, and right away after that, you get the sequence of the animals that were the basis of life at that time. And as you go down this arcade, that sequence reveals more and more the complexities of the natural order until you come to a stalactite that juts down and is blunt at the end of this long arcade, and there again you see the head, only the head of the black stallion. It's like this punctuation that you have gone through this, and now you're at a turning point, and as you come back up through the long arcade, one sees that the paintings on this side have a different quality. They colloquially called them, when they first saw them, Lascaux was discovered in 1940, they called them the Chinese horses because they are gorgeous horses. They're like the beautiful mares that have this tremendous elan and coloring. And when you come to the end of that arcade, you can't come back to the entrance because there is an offshoot going off in another direction. And as you go into that offshoot, if you were to go all the way to the end, you would come to, after a long blank spot, a very narrow, confining aspect where it gets narrower and narrower. And this is called the passage of the Felines, because all that's there are predatory lions. And the only way not to go into that funnel of predatory killerness is that there is a little offshoot that has a special quality. It goes just a little ways, a couple of meters, and then has a plunge. And the plunge is about 35, 40 feet down. And there, on that plunge, and you have to imagine that they're pretty far underground, 20,000 years ago, they had to have these little oil lamps, animal fat lamps, and they've been found all over in the floors of Lascaux. That's how they saw to paint. And when they got the initiate there, just before that plunge, one was tied with like a cord, a triple braided sinew cord. And then all the lights were put out, all the lamps were extinguished, and you were pushed over the edge. And in that darkness, that fall, you're convinced you're dead. But the cord would save you like a bungee cord. We know because in archaeology of Lascaux, bits of that cord survived for all those 20,000 years. But the painting that is there against the plunge wall, there is a rhinoceros with its big horn, the biggest power killer of all. But there is also a falling man, it's a male figure, who is so terrified that his fingers are splayed. And like in a moment of abject, dire crisis of death, a man's penis will go erect, oddly enough. And there is this stick figure of the splayed fingers and the erect penis, but he has the head of a bird. And he has dropped in his splayed fear of the moment, he has dropped a scepter, and the scepter also has the head of a bird. The royal spirit of one's bird spirit nature saves one from the absolute surety of death and allows for the transform, that you did not die and that you survived what the body considered its death, and also that you survived what the mind considered a certain death, and that one was able to come out of Lascaux double renewed. In alchemy, the alchemical tradition, both East and West, both Chinese and Egyptian, Greco-Egyptian alchemy, always had a double transform nature. The first transform is to transform the existence backbone of the earth, the metals, to raise them out of the lower metals to the highest metal that there is, the gold. But the second transform was not the transform of metals, but was the transform of minerals, because minerals, like metals, are the background of inorganic chemistry. Minerals are the background of organic chemistry. And it is the mineral transform of alchemy that was for immortal life. And the key in China for that was always cinnabar. Cinnabar is mercury and sulfur together. So mercury sulfide as a mineral is cinnabar. And you see cinnabar bracelets and bowls, and the Chinese always carve cinnabar. It's that kind of a quality. If you melt cinnabar, what comes out of it is the sulfur fumes come out and the mercury pools itself. Whereas in the other transform of alchemy, the gold is left after everything else is evaporated away in the crucible. An asbestos crucible heated to a certain temperature, all of the impurities in the ore that contains the gold will turn into ash or into a chemistry that is absorbed by the crucible, leaving only the button of molten gold, whereas the other transform leaves a button of molten mercury. So that the gold was the radiance of being able to have eternal life in nature, and the mercury was the ability to have eternal life in a spiritual cosmos. So mercury was the messenger of the gods for going under the earth. It was called the Theopompus, the leader of the spirit through the realms of death of the netherworld. And then on the upside, the leader of one to the transformations that lead to eternal life, to the cosmos. It's curious because in our times, it's so little understood. One has heard of Mercury Trismegistus, and one says, well, thrice greatest Hermes, and that the first Hermes was Thoth in Egypt. But who was the second Hermes? Who was the twice greatest Hermes? And the twice greatest Hermes is from Africa, south of Egypt, from Nubia. And in Hellenistic times, after the Peloponnesian War and before Tacitus and the Roman Empire history, there was a period where the Greek Egyptian culture became spread in an era called Hellenism, Hellenistic kingdoms. And the center of the Hellenistic kingdoms was in Egypt, in the city of Alexandria. It was not the capital just of Egypt, it was the capital of the Hellenistic world. That was a world of transform, trying to do a double transform. And at that time, one of the Ptolemies made a discovery that ancient Egypt had transformed itself. That when the black Nubian line came into play in the Egyptian lineage, that there was an efflorescence that was so brilliant that one then said of this that this was a new kingdom. That the old kingdom that had built the pyramids now was reborn in a new version of it. And the second Hermes is found in Nubian Egyptian tradition. And that's where one can locate this. At some time, I'll deliver in a book the tradition of how this happened and worked. What is peculiar is that the influence of that changed in a second transformation the whole development of Jewish civilization. And the figure that was changed by it in his time was Solomon. Solomon, the son of David, the builder of the temple. But while he was building the temple in Jerusalem, he famous for wisdom, was visited by the head of one of the largest caravans of the age. He ran about 530 camels at a time, and he was the number one commercial person, trading person, for the Queen of Sheba. And she heard of Solomon's wisdom from him, and she made a huge caravan of almost 800 camels and went to spend 6 months listening to Solomon's wisdom. And at the end of that time, when she was ready to go back to her kingdom, they had a get-together that was very esoteric, and out of that came a son 9 months later. And that son was the inheritor of the Ethiopian Nubian kingdom that his mother, the Queen of Sheba, was the head of. When he got to be of age, he wanted to go and see his real father and visited Solomon. And Solomon, when he saw him, was marveled because he said, yes, he is like me, but he is exactly like my father David. He walks the same way. He has the same mannerisms. And he wanted him to be the inheritor of the Jewish kingship. But the son told him, I have a responsibility to my mother's kingdom. And so Solomon said, therefore, we will have several kingdoms, and Ethiopia will carry a lineage just like Palestine. And we'll have a third kingdom. And so in Solomon's time, a triad of kingdoms was made out of the Jewish tradition. One of them, the middle of that, was the Nubian kingdom, the Ethiopian Nubian kingdom, which in Hellenistic Ptolemaic times was seen as the necessary mediating between two. If you didn't know the mediating third, they would become polarized. But if you knew the mediating third, then instead of being polarized, they turn into a complementarity, and they work together. And so threes are always a resolution of duality by showing that the polarity is not a duality, but is a pairedness capable of a pivot, which makes it a complementarity. And so the pivot quality is a quality that only happens in the spiritual person. The mind, being an integrator, cannot pivot. It can focus. It can realize, but it cannot dance. And so in the history of civilizations on the planet, the great focuser of the integral is the classical Buddha, the historical Buddha, the first transform that one can realize. But the second transform is because of Jesus, because he is the pivot of the spiritual person and delivers the ability to generate out of vision the historical consciousness beyond which the form is the cosmos itself. And so you have, in a very curious way, in Tacitus, he begins his history exactly where the pivot was at a crucial crossroads. Augustus Caesar, who had taken a partial control over the Roman Empire as early as 43 BC, he and two other men formed a classic triumvirate. And it was an echo of a triumvirate that his uncle, Julius Caesar, had made before him. Julius Caesar and Pompey and a most wealthy man in Rome at the time, Crassus, made a triumvirate. And pretty soon Pompey and Caesar got rid of Crassus because he's just wealthy. He doesn't have what we have, which is power. And finally Julius Caesar became all-powerful and said, I'm going to be a special dictator, not just a dictator for a year of crisis, but a dictator for life. And in order to cinch that, I'm going to also become the head of the Roman religion, the Pontifex Maximus, which is, of course, the office of the Pope. The Pontiff, because he's the Pontifex Maximus. Julius Caesar assumed that for himself and became so fearful and distasteful to the Roman nobility who had supported him. They considered him now an outsider because he had divinized himself and was no longer a part of the aristocracy of the ruling power, but now considered himself the power. And so he was killed. He was assassinated by all of his noble royal friends together. Et tu, Brute, Brutus and Cassius and all of them, who were originally in the same power group with him, because it would have been a decay of the most severe form of power in Rome, not money and not military power, but the gravitas, the dignity of the power of the individual's self-identity in the mind. And as long as one has one's power of dignity, one's gravitas, you are able to realize yourself in your life and in your society and in this world. And without it, it doesn't matter how much military power you have or how much money you have. You must have that ability. The difficulty that Tacitus points out is that Augustus Caesar, when he came into power in the second triumvirate, was the next year after his uncle was murdered by his friends, and he never forgot that you must not consider yourself the top, even though you are. And so he never styled himself emperor. He styled himself as the first among all of you. And in Latin, that word is princeps. So he never called it the Roman Empire, he called it the Principate, the Roman Principate. And its standard of power was SPQR, the Senate and the Roman people in Latin. And SPQR then was carried always on the standards of the Roman Empire, that we are in power because our gravitas is the largest that there is, and you are going to be safe in the realization of your life under our protection. And without it, you will at best be marginal, or you will be banished, or you'll be killed. And so this kind of quality, when Augustus died, after having been in power more or less for 57 years, his successor, Tiberius Caesar, is where Tacitus begins the annals of imperial Rome. And he says the way in which Tiberius assumed power after all this time was cunning beyond belief. He did not have Augustus Caesar buried right away. He waited until everyone was asking, well, and Tiberius then delivered the funeral speech. And his funeral speech for Augustus was also his self-imprimatur, coronating himself as the new, not the princeps, but the emperor. And Tiberius ruled for a number of years. And finally, after about 22 years, steadily decaying, steadily inflating, until he became a neurotic hurricane fiend who was completely controlled by astrological superstition and by this long-trained ability. Tacitus says he would know that someone was plotting against him, and he would tease them on for years, letting them create the circumstances where they would finally be confronted with irrefutable enormity that they should kill themselves. Why should I trouble to kill you or to exile you? You should commit suicide. And so Tiberius began this whole concourse of a series of Roman emperors that specialized in snaring you so that you had only one option, and that was to commit suicide. From Tiberius, it went even worse to Caligula, who was so insane that after 4 years, he was disposed of. And they picked someone who they thought would be a little easier to handle. They picked Claudius, a man that had a lisp and was like an intellectual character and was dominated by the powerful women around him, and they felt that he would be easily manipulated. And for a while, Claudius went through this charade until finally somebody who was really evil, Nero, came along with his really evil mother. And they took over from Claudius, and eventually Nero decided that the guilty party for all this, because it was getting out of hand and very mysterious, the guilty party was the city of Rome. And so the city of Rome must commit suicide. And so he burnt Rome to the ground to build a new Rome in a Nero fashion. And with that, he found a scapegoat. He said it's the Jews who've become Christians who burnt Rome down. So they need to be put into this sacrifice. They're not going to commit suicide, so they must be murdered. But they're going to not be murdered by us, but by their inept ability to confront predators like lions. And this was made a spectacle. It lasted until 68 AD, when it became so monstrous and so radioactive that in the next year, 4 different emperors tried to rule Rome, and none of them could. That the Caesar line had become so plutonium-like that no one could occupy that Roman emperor seat. And so a whole new dynasty came into play, and the new emperor was named Vespasian. And his dynasty was the Flavian dynasty. It lasted exactly himself and his 2 sons, each one worse than the next. His younger son was named Domitian, and his reign was called the Terror. And the older son was named Titus, and he's the one who said, it isn't Rome that's to blame, it's Jerusalem. And so they destroyed Jerusalem. They burnt the temple to the ground, destroyed the city of Jerusalem. And in order to bring back the trophy of the triumph that he had stolen, the power of Jerusalem, the power of the temple, he brought the symbol that was there in the temple. The Jewish symbol was not the Star of David, the shield of David, but was the menorah, a giant menorah. And he brought that on the back of elephants into Rome in a great triumphal parade. And we know because he built an arch at the point to where he came into the power center of the world, the Roman Forum, the Foro Romanum. And right there at the entrance he made, it's still there, the Arch of Titus. And in the sculpture on the frieze of the Arch of Titus, you see the parade of this triumph, and you see the big menorah on the back of an elephant and all the other treasures, that the power that was there is now ours. It's here. When you go back to the Parthenon, you find on the 524-foot frieze of the Parthenon the triumphal parade of the power of Athens in its special festival, the Pan-Athenia, the All-Athena Festival, and that the All-Athena Festival had been created by a tyrant named Pisistratus back in the 500s, and by the time that Pericles took over and brought power to himself, one of the center actors in the Peloponnesian War book by Thucydides, his way of achieving power was to make a famous funeral oration. And in the translation of the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides writes it this way: "In the same winter, the Athenians, following their annual custom, gave a public funeral for those who had been the first to die in the war. These funerals are held in the following way. 2 days before the ceremony, the bones of the fallen are brought and put in a tent which has been erected, and people make whatever offerings they wish to their own dead. Then there is a funeral procession in which coffins of cypress wood are carried on wagons. There is one coffin for each tribe, which contains the bones of members of that tribe. One empty bier is decorated and carried in the procession. This is for the missing, whose bodies could not be recovered. Everyone who wishes to, both citizens and foreigners, can join in this procession, and the women who are related to the dead are there to make their laments at the tomb. The bones are laid in the public burial place, which is the most beautiful quarter outside the city walls. And here the Athenians always bury those who have fallen in war. The only exception is those who died at Marathon, who, because of their achievement, was considered absolutely outstanding, were buried on that battlefield itself. When the bones have been laid in the earth, a man chosen by the city for his intellectual gifts and for his general reputation makes an appropriate speech of the dead. And after the speech, all depart. Now, at the burial of those who were the first to fall in the Peloponnesian War, Pericles, the son of General Xanthippus, was chosen to make the speech. And when the moment arrived, he came forward from the tomb, and standing on a high platform so that he might be heard by as many people as possible in the crowd, he spoke in the following way. And this was Pericles' way of claiming power, not only over Athens and the Athenian Confederacy, but power over the future of civilization. And in order to cement that power, he had the Parthenon built, ostensibly as a temple to Athena, but basically it was power central for Pericles and for those who would follow him. The Romans learned that lesson from the Greeks. And in the center of Rome, one of the most powerful buildings was a building built by a man named Agrippa, who was a fantastic general, but a more fantastic architect. And he built a temple called the Pantheon. And the Pantheon was the temple of all the gods that there are here in our hand. It's still there. An echo of that Pantheon is the dome of St. Peter's Cathedral across the Tiber River in the Vatican. All the power of heaven is here in this place. Empire and war always carry the same pattern of inflation. And whether it's an individual or a civilization or anything in between, there are earmarks of how to spot it, and there are transformations of how to cure it. And the cure is permanent. Next week, we'll take a look at how doctors of civilization in the future will be able to treat this and get rid of this double illness. For so long has made civilization an enemy of nature instead of a friend. More next week.